Right. Let me welcome everyone to this session on the democratic background to the Battle of Salamis. Salamis fell between the last two major democratization reforms in ancient Athens. The penultimate and most significant was in 508 under Clisthenes. Then the last one was under Ephialtes and Pericles, 2.5 decades after the battle. And democratization had to do with naval power. As a rule, in ancient Greece, people participated in ruling their cities if they fought in the defense of the city. Now, for land forces, you had to be well off to buy the equipment, which was costly. But in the navy, you could deploy poorer people as rowers, and thus expand the participation, the male participation in the political system. And so this way, there's a link between naval power and democratization. And let me now give the floor to Professor Josh Ober from Stanford University. Professor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with such distinguished colleagues and to be part of this very exciting gathering to celebrate and to analyze the Battle of Salamis and its contexts. My talk today will be attempting to make a connection between some of the work that was done yesterday in the conference, focusing on democracy and democratization and problems of democracy, problems of majoritarian forms of democracy, and some of the work that was done yesterday in terms of talking about the battle itself. So my talk today will be on the decision to fight at Salamis, and we'll be focusing on the account of the historian Herodotus and his way to let us think about the question that was a very important one for Plato, has been a very important one for contemporary political theorists. And that question is, can democracy be truly rational? Can a mass of ordinary people know enough? Can they aggregate what they know in ways that yields an ultimately rational decision? So I'm going to go now to my screen, and I hope everyone can see my screen all right. So the question then we ask is, can democracy be rational? My screen is not advancing as it was last time. Let me try this once again. All right, I think I will not use the PowerPoint. It seems not to be working properly. So I'll go directly and give you my talk directly. Among the major themes of Herodotus' sprawling histories is Athens' emergence as a military power great enough to defend Greece against the invasion launched by King Xerxes of Persia. The historian draws our attention to a vital decision made in the democratic Athenian Citizen Assembly, a decision that he believed was a turning point. 7 of the histories in explaining why and how the Greeks defeated the Persians, Herodotus underlines Athens' pivotal role in the victory. And here I quote Herodotus: "Had the Athenians been panic-struck by the threatened peril and left their own country, or had they not left it, but remained and surrendered themselves to Xerxes, none among the Greeks would have attempted to withstand the king by sea, and resistance on land would have been futile. As it is, to say that the Athenians were the saviors of Hellas is to hit the truth. It was the Athenians who held the balance. Whichever side they joined was sure to prevail. Choosing that Greece should preserve her freedom, the Athenians roused battle the other Greek states, which had not yet gone over to the Persians, and after the gods, they were responsible for driving the king off. Nor were they moved to desert Hellas by the threatened oracles which came from Delphi and sorely dismayed them, but they stood firm and had the courage to meet the invader of their country." Well, in this passage, Herodotus argues that the key moment for the Greek war effort, came when the Athenians chose not to abandon their homeland. And Herodotus emphasizes that due to their newly built navy, the Athenians had a choice between abandoning Athens and fleeing to some place in the Western Mediterranean, and on the other hand, staying to fight for their homeland. Their choice was made democratically by the Athenian citizens gathered in their citizen assembly and voting on various options. Their democratic process resulted first in the choice to build a navy, and then in the choice to take a stand at the sea off Salamis. This becomes then the linchpin of history. Those democratic choices determined the outcome of the Persian Wars and thereby set the course for the rest of Western history. If we believe Herodotus, as I think we should, we now live in a world made possible by choices that were made 2,500 years ago by the democratic citizens of Athens. So the question I want to ask is, to what extent were those rational choices, or was that just lucky? Well, Herodotus offers a detailed account of the key assembly meeting and its background. When they were faced with Persian invasion, the Athenians sought divine advice. A delegation of citizens was sent to the oracle at Delphi to consult the god Apollo. The initial response of the oracle was extremely pessimistic, urging the Athenians to flee to the ends of the earth. But the Athenian delegates, persisted in demanding a second oracular opinion, and the god's second response seemed to offer at least a glimmer of hope. God, the oracle, is recorded by Herodotus, and it goes like this: "All will be taken and lost, and yet a wooden-built wall will be granted by Zeus to the Athenians, a stronghold for you and your children. Divine Salamis, you will bring death to women's sons when the grain is scattered or the harvest gathered in." The delegation returned to Athens and reported what they had learned. The recently reformed Athenian Citizen Council then discussed the situation and put the question of what to do before the assembly, an assembly open to all Athenian citizens. At least 5,000 or 6,000 men, maybe more, gathered that day on the Pnyx, the meeting place of the assembly. They listened to arguments by trusted speakers and finally voted to commit Athens' navy to a battle in the Straits of Salamis. So the question is how did they come to that choice? In narrating that meeting of the assembly, Herodotus describes a deliberative process in which multiple parties voiced a variety of options. Herodotus shows his readers how, in the course of the assembly meeting, the Athenians weighed competing policy options. They settled on a very high risk, but also high payoff policy, and they immediately began to carry it out. Herodotus tells us the story, quote, "When the messengers had left Delphi and laid the oracle before the Demos, the people of Athens, there were many opinions seeking to explain its actual meaning. Among them, there were two that were especially noteworthy. Some of the elder men said that the god's answer signified that the Acropolis should be saved by building a wooden wall. But others supposed that the god was referring to their warships by the wooden wall comment, and they called for those to be fully equipped and nothing else. Yet those who believed their ships to be the wooden wall were confounded by the last verses of the oracle. For the expert readers of oracles, the chrysmologoi, took the verses to mean that if they offered battle near Salamis, the Athenians, would be overthrown. Herodotus carefully notes the variety of policy options that were presented. Flee to the west, that was the suggestion of the first oracle that had been received, and that was the preferred option of the expert oracle interpreters. Or a land-based policy of defense centered on the Acropolis, that was advocated by the elders, or confront the Persians with Athens' newly built navy. The very survival of Athens as a community hung on that decision. The elders urged that by wooden wall, Apollo literally meant a palisade around the sacred Acropolis. Others, however, countered that Apollo had been speaking metaphorically, that wooden wall must refer to the recently constructed wooden warships. But expert oracle interpreters warned that the oracle's line about divine Salamis bringing death to women's sons meant that Athens would be defeated should they risk a naval engagement. Well, in an autocratic political order, there would not have been a consequential public debate about the oracle's answers. A king, perhaps advised by a small council, would make the decision. In a traditional Greek civic regime, like, for example, classical Sparta, the authoritative opinion of elders, backed by acknowledged experts in oracular interpretation, would simply have ended the discussion. But Herodotus' detailed account lets his readers see that in democratic Athens, things were done differently. Because Athenian deliberations were conducted in accord with the fundamental value of isagoria, the equal right to public speech, because each individual citizen had an equal vote on the three options, the opinions of the elders and oracular experts failed to decide the matter. Herodotus allows his reader to see that the Athenian system of decision-making was at once majoritarian, that is, the majority would decide. It was rationally cooperative, that is, they would seek to use what they knew to come to a decision that was best for each and all. And it was based on the gathering and sifting of diverse sources of information. No plan could be adopted in democratic Athens until a majority of those in the assembly believed that it was the best among all the available options, best for themselves as individuals and best for their community. So how did they decide? What information was available to the Athenian demos, the assemblymen who gathered that day, other than the oracles themselves? Well, the relatively wealthy hoplite infantrymen, who made up perhaps a third of the citizen population, must have recognized that Thermopylae had been turned. There was no hope that an Athenian land army could fight in the open field against the massive forces commanded by the Persian king. So, unless they were willing to follow the lead of the traditionalist elders, which meant suffering a doomed siege behind an improvised wooden fence, the infantrymen could offer no land-based strategy that would save Athens. Meanwhile, many of the poorer Athenians had been training as rowers since the construction of the navy several years before. They knew a lot from personal experience about the operational capacity of these newly built warships. Their interests would be advanced by a naval victory. Service in a successful navy offered poor men a chance to live better lives, perhaps to share in plunder, but more important, to share in the public honors uniquely available to those who risk their lives in defense of their community. But those eager to fight at sea were held back by the oracle's grim prediction of doom. The expert oracle interpreters said that it was a losing proposition. So at this impasse, Themistocles, an established leader, but not in any way the president of Athens, holding no, as far as we know, official office other than general, stood up to challenge the elders' and experts' interpretation of the Delphic information. He argued that the expert readers of oracles had incorrectly interpreted the whole of the oracle, and he reasoned that if the verse referring to the death of women's sons, really pertained to the Athenians, it would have been formulated in harsher language. That is, the oracle would have called Salamis cruel rather than divine, seeing that the Athens inhabitants were the ones to perish. Correctly understood, the god's oracle referred not to the death of Athenians, but of their enemies, and his advice was that they should believe their ships to be the wooden wall, that is, the stronghold for the Athenians. That's the end of the quote from Herodotus. With Themistocles' interpretation before them, the many Athenians who had reason to believe in the capacity of the fleet to save the state were presented with a way to align their interests as rowers, their military, their interests, their knowledge of military preparedness, and the religious information provided by the oracle. The infantrymen, for their part, were offered a hope for success and an honorable way out of the suicidal Acropolis defense strategy. They would fight as Marines. The infantrymen could fight as Marines, stand guard on the shores of Salamis. Fighting a naval battle then became a rational choice for any formerly undecided citizens. It was rational for the rowers, rational for the hoplites, and rational for any who still were unsure about what to do. The outcome then was a near consensus about what was the best policy. Herodotus writes, the Athenians judged Themistocles to be a better counselor than the expert readers of oracles who would have had them prepare for no sea fight and, in short, to offer no resistance at all, but to leave Attica and settle in some other country. Herodotus concludes his account of decision-making in the advance of the battle at Salamis with a sentence that echoes the formal language of the democratic government. Quote, in their debate after the giving of the oracular response, they accordingly resolved, edoxe desfi, that's the mirroring of that government language. They accordingly resolved that they would put their trust in the god and meet the foreign invasion of Hellas with the whole power of their fleet, ships, and men, and with all other Greeks who were so minded. So Herodotus' narrative of the Athenian decision to fight the Persians at sea focuses on the ways in which Athenians sought out information and deliberated on the basis of that information. The process of deliberation over the meaning of the new information was carried out openly. Multiple opinions were offered on the various options. The elders were respectfully listened to, and specialist experts were consulted, but their interpretation, which could not account for what many Athenians in the assembly knew and believed, especially about the capacity of the navy, so their interpretation, elders and experts' interpretation, failed to carry the day. Finally, a speaker offered an interpretation that aligned religious information with social and technical knowledge about emergent Athenian naval capacity. And that interpretation offered a way for the community to act with both courage and reason in its own defense. It allowed the Athenians to align behind a single policy and therefore to achieve near consensus in decision. Were it not for Athens' political order, in which equality among citizens included equality and respect to public speech, the preference of the elders to fight on the Acropolis, conjoined with the expert judgment of the expert oracle interpreters, would have made Themistocles' intervention ineffective. The Athenians would not have fought at Salamis. Some would have fled to the west. After the brave, foolhardy defenders of the Acropolis palisade had been slaughtered, Athens would have been lost. The rest of Greece would have been absorbed into the Persian Empire. There would have been no 5th century Golden Age, no 4th century reinvention of democracy, no Plato or Aristotle to write political philosophy. Of course, they might have existed, but they wouldn't have been writing political philosophy in the way they did. The decision to fight at sea at Salamis was, as Herodotus makes clear, the choice that made all that possible. And the choice to fight at Salamis was, as he makes equally clear, the result of democratic procedures. Those procedures were not just about majority rule, although they were concerned with majority rule, but not only about majority rule, but also about freedom of speech, about equality of influence, about the organization of the information essential to making the best possible public decision. Now, democracy, demokratia, was, as Herodotus well knew, the name of a form of government that enabled the ordinary people of Athens to express their joint capacity for deliberation, for rational choice, and for decisive action. Demokratia was the name for a system enabling many citizens with diverse wants and needs to focus on what they most valued, to share what they knew and believed, to identify and defend the public good. In our own age, especially in my own country, of polarized political parties and populists who admire and mimic autocrats, when trust in constitutional procedure is waning, when information is at once superabundant and super chaotic, we would do well to reflect on what democracy originally meant to those who first invented it. Thank you.
Fascinating talk. The argument is that democracy allowed a majority to overcome the resistance of the elders and the oracle experts to giving battle. And thus, Western civilization was saved through this crucial decision. Right, let me now move to Professor Alan Bresler of the University of Chicago. The floor is yours, Professor.
Okay, thank you. So I will immediately start maybe with the PowerPoint. It will be easier, if it's possible, to have the PowerPoint online on the video. We had a little technical problem, and now that it is solved, and we shall move. Anyway, that's great. Thank you. First, I would like to thank the organizers for this event, for inviting me to this fascinating conference. Among many of their achievements, the Greeks of antiquity famously invented political science. It remains fascinating that even today, Plato and Aristotle are still required readings for students and scholars of political science. Thucydides inspires political thinkers or strategists. One of the assumptions of the Greek thinkers, in fact, in their own history, that political regimes did not remain stable forever, but subject to change in one direction or the other, for the better or for the worse. Thus, in Book 6 of his Histories, the famous book devoted to the Constitution of Rome, Polybius offers a description of the transformation that these regimes could experience. Next slide, please. So, this is Polybius. So then we enumerate 6 forms of government, the 3 commonly spoken of, which I've just mentioned, which are kingship, aristocracy, and democracy, or allied forms, despotism, oligarchy, and mob rule. The first of these arises, that's despotism, without artificial aid in the natural order of events. Next to this, and produced from it by the aid of art and adjustments, comes kingship, which is degenerating into the evil form allied to it, by which I mean tyranny, both at once more destroyed and produced. Again, the latter, that is aristocracy, being in the course of nature perverted to oligarchy, and the people patiently revenging the unjust acts of their rulers, democracy comes into existence, which again, by its violence and contempt of law, becomes sheer mob rule. This description by Polybius echoes directly the discussions of yesterday on the stability of political regimes. Ancient thinkers were perfectly aware that political regimes change over time, are not a given forever. This raises the question of why this was or this is the case. A political regime is a product of, on the one hand, of, so to speak, an endogenous political evolution. New political conditions create new political aspirations, which can have positive outcome and help the regime to maintain itself, or quite the opposite, have negative consequences and threaten its very existence. However, Polybius gives us, so to speak, recipes for maintaining the good version of political regime. Once again, this echoes the debates of yesterday. For instance, what makes the difference between aristocracy and oligarchy is the quality of the leader. A true aristocracy exists only when the power is wielded by the justest and wisest men selected on their merit. One thinks, of course, of Thucydides, and in this presentation, not of aristocracy, but of democracy. Next slide, please. In a passage which has been the object of many contradictory interpretations, Thucydides explains that Athenian democracy was based on the fact that this regime favored the many and not only the few, that it rendered equal justice to all, but also that it could benefit from the expertise and service of everyone. And this is again Thucydides, nor again does poverty bar the way if the man is able to serve the state, hindered by the obscurity of his condition. This observation is fundamental. A political regime such as democracy is based on the active participation of everyone, whatever his social condition is. Thucydides was thinking of men only, of course, in this context, not of women. This is very famous, and maybe a restriction. This meant that expertise was not left aside and lost, but that it benefited the regime. This also indicates that the success of a regime like democracy was linked to its capacity to mobilize men of all conditions, in other words, to create a new kind of elites. Next slide. Then, at this point, one thinks inevitably of another, even more famous passage of Thucydides, where he presents the role of Pericles in the Athenian democracy. Whenever he saw them unreasonably and insolently elated, he would, with a word, reduce them to alarm. And on the other hand, if they fell victims to a panic, he could at once restore them to confidence. In short, what was nominally a democracy became in his hands government by the first citizen. Thucydides contradicts himself. First, indeed, Athens was a democracy in the passage quoted before, and then asserting that in fact it was not, but it was the government of only one man. The answer is no. The two passages develop the same theme. Democracy needs the active participation, collaboration, and leadership of its own elites that it has itself generated, or traditional elites such as Greeks. This once again echoes with yesterday's debate on the role of elites, and this is, of course, one favorite topic of Josh Ober. The question of expertise and elite provides also the opportunity to come back to Polybius, for he also emphasizes their role when he talks of both kingship and aristocracy. The next slide, please. We cannot hold every absolute government to be a kingship, but only that which is accepted voluntarily and is directed by an appeal to reason rather than to fear and force. Nor again every oligarchy to be regarded as an aristocracy. The latter exists only where the power is wielded, justice and wise men select. In other words, for instance, for aristocracy, being wealthy, own line of famous ancestors is not sufficient to be able to bring a useful contribution to the regime. Now, when in the same passage he introduces the case of democracy, Polybius adds yet another dimension. Next slide, please. Similarly, it's not enough to constitute a democracy that the whole crowd of citizens should have the right to do whatever they propose, but where reverence to the gods, succor of parents, respect to elders, obedience to laws are traditional and habitual in such communities, if the will of the majority prevail, we may speak of the form of government as a democracy. So good leadership is necessary for democracy to function in an orderly manner. But it supposes also that the society also is ordered. The good customs exists to gods, assistance, respect to elders, obedience to law, all point to a sense of respect of traditional hierarchies well beyond politics. Reverence to the gods supposes the acceptance of a traditional order of organization of the world. Assistance to parents and respect to all the elders have to do with private life, and certainly beyond the respect to older generation, with acceptance of the traditional forms of kinship organization. For Polybius, a democracy needs a stable social organization and citizens respectful of traditional orders to be able. It needs also citizens who have interiorized the law and are prepared to obey them. If this is not the case, democracy is what he calls the rule of ochlokratia. Of course, this was a regime abhorred by Polybius, himself a member of the rich Peloponnesian elite and a conservative politician. But this is not the fundamental point. The challenge posed to democracy, ancient or modern, is there. First, how is it possible to reconcile the fundamentally egalitarian principles of democracy with the acceptance of the necessary role of some elites? The answer is to be found in Thucydides rather than Polybius. These elites should not be recruited on traditional criteria of economic and social capital, but on criteria of expertise and on the contribution they may bring to the welfare of the community. Second question, how is it possible to reconcile obedience to the law, acceptance, and accepting inevitable social change? Despite Polybius' stubborn and narrow conservatism, societies are subject to change. Not dealing with these challenges paves the way for the most serious civil disturbances and may even lead to challenge the existence of the democratic regime. But for democracies, accepting social change is not necessarily a path lined with roses. For modern democracies in the United States, the question of slavery and its abolition is civil war. But it should be emphasized that, by contrast, not a ancient democratic regime, the other forms of political organization, ever even envisaged to suppress slavery. As for the political rights of women, it was only in the 20th century that women obtained the right to vote. By contrast, again, no ancient democracy even envisaged such a move. In that sense, modern democracies have proved to be far superior to the ancient ones in their capacity to absorb social change. And for failing to make these and other decisive moves, ancient democracy has to pay a high price. This is their story of the absorption by Rome of the Greek world, and eventually of the final destruction of what remained of democracy in the Greek world in a new order imposed by Rome. Just like in the world of today, ancient democracy were not alone. They competed with other forms of social and political organization. The Battle of Salamis was a battle between two peoples, the Greeks and the Persians, as an imperial power that was in control of the whole eastern Mediterranean region, extending from Cyrene in northern Greece to India and Central Asia. So nothing seems to stop the Persians, and one should not think that they could have not only on the morale of their opponents, the faith of their own institutions. Success of the proof that institutions were more efficient than those of the Greeks, especially of the new democracies of cities like Athens. Wasn't it time to side with the Persians and to adopt their mode of social and political organization? The difference to be made between the Persian Empire and the ancient Greek cities, especially the democratic one, can be analyzed in terms of Douglas North, John Wallis, and Barry Weingast in their book Violence and Social Orders. Next slide, please. North leagues define two types of societies. Society which are natural state societies. That's to say, natural state society is a society based on personal relationships, on the power of a wealthy, which makes it best maximizing its own advantages, and on rent seeking. This is a limited access society where the wealthy elite organizes its privileges. The sharing of the profits is also a way to check the conflicts between the components of this elite. By contrast, Athens could be described as an open access society. It was based on the creation of a network of non-personal relations, and the principle was the equality before the law of the members of the community, and even beyond of some foreigners like traders. The fundamental principle of economic life was that of the market, an institution where everybody was legally equal, which contrasted with the fundamentally inegalitarian nature of the economic organization of the Persian Empire. The difference between the two systems were clearly perceived by the Greeks themselves, and probably also by the Persians, although we have only the Greek version of the story. Next slide, please. At the end of the Archaic period, the Ephesian philosopher Heraclitus could proclaim that the people must fight in defense of the law as the wall. The ancient Greek world were ruled by law. Law provided the fundamental institution for development of property and self-contracting. In classical or Hellenistic Greek, if a contract was breached, the parties could come before the court and get fair justice from judges sorted by lot, a perfectly impersonal mode of rendering justice. It's not by chance that so many laws of the ancient world are mentioned in our sources. Some of them are known to us thanks because they have been preserved on stone. It's not by chance also that the reflection of the thinkers of the classical period focuses on law, nomos, suffices to think of Plato's laws, on the state, on its organization, or thinks of Plato's politia, what we call the republic, or Aristotle politica, or politics. This is, of course, the Greek version, but according to Herodotus, When in 545, King Cyrus of Persia was about to attack the Greek cities on the Ionian coast, the Spartans informed him that they considered themselves the protectors of their cities. According to, next slide please, according to Herodotus, Cyrus still knew nothing about the Spartans. When he learned who they were, he said, I never feared men who set apart a place in the middle of the city where they perjure themselves, deceive. For Herodotus, the agora and its laws symbolized the Greek city. The other side was that of a hierarchical order. Herodotus judged the world through the category of exchange because it was consubstantial with the system of the polis. And when I say exchange, it's exchange of goods, but also exchange of words, exchange of opinions, as was exposed by Josh Ober in his presentation. In other words, the choice, and let's say the decision made at Salamis was, in the end, a conflict between two very different forms of political, social, and economic organization. It's clear that if the Greeks had been defeated at Salamis, the fate would have been very different from which was theirs in the classical and Hellenistic period. Thank you.
It's important to clarify that democracy can degenerate to autocracy. And we see that with the demagogic right in Europe, phenomenon in America. So that's a discussion that has resonates in our contemporary world. Now, the next speaker, Professor Pritchard, unfortunately, is unable to be with us. He was unwell earlier. And because of the 7-hour difference in Australia, it's already 2 in the morning. So he felt that he couldn't stay so late, being unwell. But he sent us his presentation, and I'll read it. I know it's not the same, but it's the best we can do at the moment. So his presentation is From Where the Fine Warships Come, Democratic Athens at War. And his introduction begins with the assertion that this week, 2,500 years ago, a Greek fleet off the waters of Athens defeated a much larger Persian fleet. This naval victory against the odds put an end to the long-term plan of the Persian Empire to subjugate all the Balkans. It began the decades-long war that Athens would lead to expel the Persians entirely from the Dardanelles, Anatolia's coasts, and the Aegean Sea's islands. Salamis, in 480 BC, is thus probably the turning point in the history of classical Greece. At the time, the Greeks agreed that the Athenians had contributed the most to this unlikely victory. This battle was possible only because the Athenian demos, or people, a few years earlier had decided to build Greece's largest fleet of state-owned warships, the triremes. The decision to put every last Athenian on their decks gave the Greeks a fighting chance. Yet these innovative and courageous decisions by the demos were not one-offs. They were part of a remarkable record of military success that dated back to their foundation of Athenian democracy a few decades earlier. Now, regarding the democratic revolution, today ancient Athens is famous for democracy. In 508 BC, the Athenian demos rose against the leader aiming for tyranny and expelled him, plus the foreign troops backing his attempt. They had had enough of the bloody struggles of their elite and demanded an active role in the decision-making of their state. This popular demand was quickly realized by the reformer Clisthenes. His democratic reforms made the assembly and the now popular council the final arbiters of public actions and laws. We now know that several other Greek polis, or city-states, experimented with popular government before 508. Therefore, the invention of democracy, alas, can no longer be attributed to Athens, but Athenian Demokratia was different in that it avoided the civil wars that destroyed so many other democracies. With the exception of 2 short periods of oligarchy, it enjoyed 2 centuries of unbroken operation. This state's strong financial position meant that in the 420s could spend 3.9 tons of silver per year, employing thousands to run the government. This state pay allowed a much wider social spectrum of citizens to be politically active. The result of these differences was that Athenian democracy was more fully developed than any other pre-modern example. The next unit is about the Cultural Revolution. Athens was also the leading cultural center of the classical world, the classical Greek world. The arts, oratory, drama, and literature were developed to a higher level of sophistication in this city-state than in any other. Admittedly, these cultural innovations depended on the immense wealth of classical Athens and its ability to spend huge sums on festival-based contests. For example, in the 420s, the state, as well as elite taxpayers, spent 750 kilograms of silver per year on their main drama festival. Annual spending on all festivals was a staggering 2.6 tons of silver. Nevertheless, ever since Johann Joachim Winckelmann, the 18th century pioneer of classical archaeology, ancient historians have attributed this cultural revolution to Athenian democracy. The famous plays of classical Athens are a good example. They may have been written by elite playwrights, but they were performed at contests before thousands of non-elite theater goers. Officially, the judging of these contests was in the hands of 10 judges, but these judges were swayed by the noisy reactions of non-elite theater goers. By going to the theater regularly, the demos acquired an increasingly sophisticated appreciation of drama. Comedians and tragedians thus realized that their chances of winning were increased if they constantly innovated in their respective genres. The next unit is on the military revolution, which is my sort of area of expertise. Ancient Athens, my meaning Harry Popper's interior. Ancient Athens is famous for such achievements. By contrast, its military revolution is not widely known. More than any other polis, this city-state invented or perfected new forms of combat, strategy, and military organization. It was directly responsible for raising the scale of Greek warfare by 10 times. In doing this, the Athenian demos overcame the traditional conception of courage that elsewhere impeded military innovations. This revolution represented a qualitative change from their military record before democracy. 6th century Athenians went to war usually only for the sake of contested borderlands. Their campaigns, which were extremely infrequent, went for days or a few weeks and were settled by a single land battle. They were initiated not by the state, but by the leaders of aristocratic factions. These leaders privately raised volunteers by promising them the land to be won in battle. The hoplites of such campaigns were predominantly elite and numbered only in the hundreds. This small-scale war-making was transformed in the first instance by the democratic reforms that Clisthenes introduced soon after 508 BC. These reforms massively increased the readiness of non-elite Athenians to serve in the armed forces and to start wars. In 506, their new public army defeated those of Chalkis and Boeotia in back-to-back battles. In 499, the demos sent warships to help Anatolia's Greeks rebel from the Persian Empire. In 490 at Marathon, they deployed 9,000 heavily armed soldiers. Clisthenes' democratic reforms effectively integrated Athens and its hora, the countryside, for the first time. Each free male was now registered as a citizen of Athens in his local village, and groups of Attica's villages were linked together in 10 new tribes. These tribes served as the subdivisions of the new democratic council and the new public army of hoplites. These village registers of Athenians were used to conscript hoplites. Remarkably, this was the state's first ever effective mechanism for mass mobilization. Attica was around 20 times more populous than the hora of an average polis. Therefore, this mechanism gave Athens a huge military advantage. Demography would be a major reason for military success of classical Athens. The events of the late 480s and the early 470s set in train a second wave of Athenian military innovations. In order to get ready for the return of the Persians, the Athenian people decided in 483 to direct unexpected public income from local silver mines towards the massive expansion of the new public navy. The 200 warships that they possessed at the end of this shipbuilding represented the largest fleet of state-owned warships yet seen. 3 years later, Persia's great king launched his expedition to subjugate the Greeks of the Balkans, as he had recently done to those of Anatolia and the Dardanelles. The final destruction of this huge Persian force in 479 saw the Athenians invited to found the Delian League. Initially, this league was a voluntary alliance of states contributing ships and soldiers or annual tribute to Athenian-led expeditions. For its first decades, the league campaigned to expel Persians from their bases across the Aegean Sea. At the same time, the Athenians began eroding the independence of league members, who by the 450s were obliged to pay annual tribute and had long been forcefully prevented from pulling out of what was now the Athenian archi, or empire. Imperial revenues allowed the Athenians to employ vast numbers of non-elite citizens as hoplites and sailors, and to perfect forms of warfare that broke decisively from the hoplite-based conception of courage. Among numerous military innovations, they could now man large fleets and train their naval crews for months. Each crew could work collectively to take part in maneuvers at speed with other ships. In this new form of mobile naval warfare, a standard tactic was retreat. Retreat was a source of shame among heavily armed soldiers. The Athenians also built tens of kilometers of walls to protect and to link Athens and the Piraeus. With these fortifications in place, they developed a new way of responding to the invasion of a land army. They no longer sent out their hoplites for a land battle when their chora was invaded. Instead, they withdrew their farmers and movable property within the Athens Piraeus fortifications. They relied on imported food supplies that the sea power guaranteed. By the 450s, the Athenians were moving many thousands of hoplites and sailors across the entire eastern Mediterranean for campaigns that lasted months, or in the case of sieges, up to a few years. They now waged war more frequently than ever before, doing so in 2 out of 3 years. They were directing more money to all other public activities combined. In the 420s, for example, annual public spending on war was 39 tons of silver per year. Clearly, the unprecedented supply of income from the archi was a second major reason for the military success of 5th century Athens. The next unit is on democratic war. The timing of this military revolution is very striking. The Athenian transformation of war directly follows the democratic revolution of 508. It coincides with the cultural revolution that was largely brought about by Athenian democracy. The near contemporaneousness of these 3 revolutions opens up a challenging possibility. The military aggression of 5th century Athens could well be another product of Athenian democracy. It could well be the dark side of the Athenian cultural revolution. Consequently, democracy may be the 3rd major reason for the military success of 5th century Athens. In Athenian democracy at war, I argue that the military impact of this democratia had 2 sides. On one side, there was the competition of elite performers in front of non-elite adjudicators that resulted in a pro-war culture. This encouraged the Athenians to join the armed forces in ever-increasing numbers and regularly to vote for war. The other side consisted of democracy's rigorous debating of war. This open debate reduced this militarism's risks and encouraged military reforms. It helped to develop the initiative of the state's generals, soldiers, and sailors. Non-elite Athenians understandably had a positive view of their own military service. Consequently, they supported those politicians and playwrights who employed epic poetry's depiction of soldiering to describe what they did as hoplites and sailors. This depiction had been the preserve of the elite before Athenian democracy. At the same time, poor Athenians were still ashamed of their poverty. Therefore, this extension of the traditional conception of arete courage down the social scale made soldiering attractive to them as a source of social esteem. Unfortunately, this recognition of courage among non-elite hoplites and sailors proved to be a double-edged sword. While making them feel proud, it put them under social pressure to participate in and to vote for wars. For RAT, as far as the Greeks were concerned, had to be regularly proven by actions. Those who saw themselves as courageous felt shame to be accused of cowardice. Athenians could be so accused not only if they retreated from a battle before others, but also if they failed to endorse a war that appeared to be necessary. The result was that the politicians exploited the fear of shame among assemblies to build support for their proposals for war. The open debating of foreign policy in Athenian democracy never reduced the willingness of the demos to be combatant and to start wars. But it did normally reduce the risk that they would endorse poorly conceived proposals for war. In foreign policy debates, politicians were free to make contentious arguments. Their intense rivalries with each other ensured that any proposal for war met opposing arguments and peaceful options. These rivalries also promoted the efficient prosecution of ongoing campaigns because politicians closely scrutinized the military campaigns that their rivals had successfully proposed. The constant adjudication of such debates by the demos consolidated their general knowledge of foreign affairs and hence improved the general quality of their decisions about war and peace. In addition, this high-order deliberative capacity of the demos enabled them both to see the merits of military innovations that went against traditional morality and also to take more initiative as combatants than their non-democratic rivals. David M. Pritchard. Right. This concludes my reading of this presentation. We can now move to the next speaker, Professor Kyriazis. If he is linked up, he's present. Well, he's supposed to be here. I mean, he's supposed to be. All right. Well, I guess it'll be in a quarter of an hour. So if you want, we can have a discussion, the three of us, or the two of you, sort of, on these points that Professor Pritchard made. All right. I hope I was legible in reading them out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good. Interesting argument, right? That democracy meant innovation because those who fought actually made the decision to fight. Right? So they wanted more effective means. Yes, that's one of his important points.
I may intervene. I don't know if it's.
Please.
Yes, David Pritchard's paper is fascinating. And there are modern parallels in some ways. It's very striking. And the mobilization, the new mobilization that Cleistenic reforms allowed can in some way be compared to the extraordinary dynamic period of the French Revolution, also in the wars against European powers in 1792 and the following years. France was also able to mobilize a very large army. It was kind of the first mass mobilization of modern times. And this allowed France also to have great successes, at least for a while, against its opponents. It's exactly the same thing as this happened in Athens. The ability, democracy was also a formidable mobilizing, a machine to mobilize people. And it was a military machine. And maybe it's not necessarily, we are, let's say, our modern view is to connect, of course, democracy and peace, more or less, because it's always, making peace is always the best decision. And I think in modern thinking, but not in ancient thinking, I think for our audience, this should be underlined and emphasized that war was the agenda of Athens all the time. I mean, 2 years after, apparently in the 5th and 4th century, Athens was at war. And it tells a lot about the situation. David's point is absolutely fundamentally correct, and also the other recipe of the success of the Athenian democracy, and the point is made very clearly in the Persians, Aeschylus' Persian, is that they have the silver, they have the economic resources to wage their wars and to fund their democracies, and this, of course, gives them an edge over their even their Greek partners, and not to mention their opponents, the Persians. So the Persians were very rich, but maybe money is not sufficient. That's another side.
I wanted to ask you. Obviously, the numbers of the Persian army that Herodotus gives us they cannot be true. I mean, before the railroads, you could have armies so large.
Right. I mean, I don't think that there was any way that anybody in antiquity knew how many people that Xerxes brought with him. Herodotus tries to estimate it by the amount of water they drink going through the Thrace and so on. But clearly, it's an overestimate. But it was a very large army, and it was certainly large enough that there was no possibility for beating that army as it was first brought into Greece in the open field. They could try to hold the pass at Thermopylae, but of course the pass was turned. And at that point, that's really Herodotus' point. There was no way for the Greeks to win this unless they could eliminate the advantage that the Persians had in naval strength. If you could get rid of the Persian navy, then the Persians would have to withdraw most of their army because the army was resupplied through the navy. Much too large, and we don't know how large it is, but it's much too large to be fed on the land. Now, just take the crops or something. They had to resupply. The Persians had to resupply by sea, and that's why Salamis is such a key victory. Because if you can knock out enough of the Persian navy, then it's necessary for the king to withdraw most of his army, as he did. And then the remaining part of the army was small enough that the combined Greek forces could challenge the remaining Persian forces as they do at the Great Battle of Plataea. And that's a hard fall that might have gone the other way, but the Greeks win that one too. So that's why Salamis is so important. I mean, Salamis was the only way to beat the big part of the Persian navy, was the only way you're ever going to get anything like parity on the battlefield. So looking forward to David Pritchard's argument, I think that it's important to realize two things. That democracy, when it first emerges, does in fact, or at least can, create huge increase in state capacity. That's really what we see. We see Athens jumping forward in state capacity. Herodotus makes this absolutely clear in a famous passage. He says, before this, Athens was not a particularly dominant state before democracy, and then afterwards it is. And this is because now the state can use the immense human resources of a large community, large by Greek standards, and doesn't have to be turned against itself. So every oligarchy is ultimately turned against itself. The great majority of people are not benefiting from the regime, and the oligarchs, the rulers, need then to spend a lot of energy keeping in control the large numbers of people who are not benefiting from the regime and finding ways to prevent those large numbers of people from organizing against the oligarchs. So oligarchy is and Plato is very clear on this. Oligarchy is just not very good at generating large scale state capacity. first, you get this big jump in state capacity, especially if you get a kind of government that is able to defeat what political scientists, Harry, you know about this, are called the resource curse. That is a small group capturing a resource like silver mines and using it for their own advantage rather than for the advantage of the community. So one of the things that happens when Athens democratizes is they basically beat the resource curse. They take the community resource of the silver mines and use it for the good of the community instead of the good of a few oligarchs who are raking off all of the wealth. So now you've got this natural resource, which can be used to increase the capacity of the state, and you have this large population all aligned to the same ends. And the first big breakthrough is in the Persian Wars, when it becomes clear that Athens can do a remarkable thing at Salamis. But then, as David Pritchard points out, you can go on and fight more wars. So the second big point, democracy allows for the really big increase in state capacity, but that state capacity may not be used towards what we would regard as today sort of moral or justifiable or even decent ends. You may use that increase of capacity to just take other people's stuff. That's what the Athenians did for some time. So I think it's important for us to remember that democracy has this effect of becoming, or potentially, increasing state capacity, but then we have to ask, how is that capacity to be used? And that's another question. I think the long-term history of Athens is, in part, the coming to recognize that the use of the increased capacity of the democratic state for these, merely aggressive imperialistic purposes was in the end self-defeating. And the history of Athens in the 4th century BC, in the time of Plato and Aristotle, is really the history of a state that is trying to come to grips with how a democracy can be successful, can be prosperous, without being simply aggressive and imperialistic. And of course, Alain Bresson has told us exactly how that works, that you become a commercial state.
Right. It's interesting that people sometimes assume that democracies are peaceful, at least with each other. Machiavelli thought very differently. He thought republics are actually more effective at fighting wars because he knew ancient history. And if you look at least post-war American history, it's a very warlike republic. Right? Yeah. And wars are initially very popular. If they last too long, then popularity declines. But the American people support decisions to go to war, not against democracies, it's true, but against non-democratic regimes. And as Alain said, the French Revolution is a clear example, where immediately military capacity increases, the point where France takes on all of the rest of Europe. Right? It's an astonishing increase in military power. Right?
Yeah, we see this in the 17th century in England with the English Revolution, the new style army that Cromwell organizes turns out to be a much more effective fighting machine than anything that the king's forces, the royal forces, can put against it. And it's the same sort of thing. You get this explosion of capacity because of something like that was as close to democracy as England was going to get for a very long time. In the end, of course, Cromwell becomes something of a tyrant. The whole thing falls apart. In the end, in the French Revolution, Napoleon, and so you get various knock-on effects there. But I think that's quite consistent that we see this result with the move to democratization comes this really increase in capacity, and that increase in capacity is expressed through increased military activity and successful military activity.
Right. Yeah. So
I think it is one of the great questions that a democracy has to ask is how can that capacity be channeled into something other than just brutal imperialism?
Right. True. But it's, I guess, very difficult to do that.
It is, exactly. And, you see in the history of the United States, even in the 20th century into the 21st century, there's a tendency for the United States as a successful democracy with high capacity to get involved in wars that are not particularly advantageous because you say, well, we have the capacity, we can do it. You look at when I was growing up, a young man, the war in Vietnam was clearly an example of a democratic state that said, we have the ability to impose our will in this part of the world, and therefore we will impose our will in that part of the world. Turned out to work out very badly, as some of Athens' wars didn't work out well either. But I think it has the same idea that we can do it. Look at how wealthy we are. Look at how many men we have. Look at our technology. Of course we can impose our will on others. The question is, do we have the wisdom not to do that, even if we think that we can?
I remember during the unipolar moment phase, both President Clinton and President Bush said now is a chance to promote democracy around the world, change the trajectory. So you have the temptation because you're the only superpower. But because these wars didn't go so well, the next two presidents were much more retrenched. Both Obama in a different way, Trump.
No,
so Obama did not get involved in Syria. Trump has been trying to pull out. So, so I guess it swings back and forth.
Quite right.
All right. I think Professor Kiazis, he said he would be here just about now.
Okay, we can.
He's not here yet.
Oh well, it's do we have this? Do we have anything on the chat page? Do we have any questions from the audience that we should be looking at? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Athens against the view of the democratic peace. That's a big debate in IR.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole question of the democratic peace, it's an interesting literature, but the idea that at least liberal democracies do not go to war against other liberal democracies. So of course, the big ancient challenge to that model is the Athenian invasion of Sicily, attacking the leading state of Sicily, Syracuse, which is another democracy. Thucydides' description of that campaign makes it very clear that Athens is having a terrible time fighting Syracuse, in part because Syracuse is another democracy. It's almost the mirror state to Athens, and the Athenians cannot use some of the techniques that they had used against some oligarchic states, that is, sort of divide and conquer, sort of encourage the ordinary people to be on the side of Athens against the local oligarchs, because Syracuse was united. And it had a large navy, just like Athens had a large and effectively trained infantry, and was coherent, was not prone to internal civil war. And all of those are factors that make it very difficult for Athens to defeat this fellow democracy. So at least one, I don't think this is part of the literature on the democratic peace, but is it partly that democracies don't fight to other democracies because other democracies are likely to be pretty tough opponents?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I wonder if this summer we had a war breaking out in Greece and Turkey. Oh, here's Professor Kyriazis.
Yes, hello. Pleased to meet you again and to join you.
Okay, we welcome Professor Kyriazis.
Welcome to everybody, to all friends. Thank you. Shall I start or do you?
Please, yeah, the floor is yours.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So our intervention, it's a common intervention with Emmanuel Marios Economou. And what we would like to do is to try to give you a theory of why democracy was established in Athens. What we would like to do is to say what the preconditions for this was, and we follow a multi-dimensional approach. We think that there were four different factors which made democracy possible to be created in ancient Athens. And the first one is the art of war. As you well know, we had the phalanx, which was a very particular military formation, where the hoplites, which were middle-class people, were standing one near the other, 8 deep, in 8 rows deep, and the shield, the oplon, covered the uncovered right side of the hoplite who was standing next to the one. But this particular formation was a formation which was very, very egalitarian. Everybody was more or less, had more or less the same income. They were free farmers and they were equal in the field of battle. Even the general usually participate in the field of battle. And this was, as we tried to show in more extent, was a very efficient coordination and cooperation mechanism. So actually, in the phalanx, everybody should step on the same wreath. We're fighting in a very tight formation. Nobody ran before, nobody stayed behind, with some exceptions, perhaps in marathon and so on. But generally, everybody was standing near the other. And this actually was a formation which promoted some very particular values. For example, as I said before, equality, self-confidence, trust to the neighbor, the man who was standing near. But this was very important, as we will show later on, for the establishment of democracy. The second factor was religion. If one looks into the Homeric epics, for example, in Iliad, we have some places where we have the gods arguing for and against their heroes in the Trojan Wars, some of them taking the part of the Greeks, some of them taking the part of the Trojans. But what is important is that there we have actually something which we could call even a parliament of the gods. Everybody speaks. Everybody is free to say his opinion. And what is very important, the female goddesses have the same rights as the male gods. For example, Hera, whom, as we know, did not like very much her husband because he was very unfaithful, as we know, Zeus and so on. In some places, well, he's very critical of her husband and speaks very openly against him and so on. But this actually was also something which is very important because the Greek religion, apart from being very equalitarian, as Homer and Hesiod shows the gods when they speak with one another, is a religion also which has no established priesthood, which participates in politics, like, for example, the Egyptian one or the Babylonian one. And they have also no written divine law, as, for example, in Egypt or the Jews and so on. And this leaves a place again for human intervention. So if you don't have a divine law or divine rules or whatever, there is a big room for the humans to establish the law. And also we have also the equalitarian principle even in the parliament of the gods, as we call it. So this is the second influence. The third one is the athletics, and we must say also these all are preconditions because they precede the establishment of democracy. Athletics, the Olympics, there again you have a perfect equalitarian society or rules. Everybody, every Greek free citizen may participate, and what is very important, they are naked. And that means that you cannot show if you are an aristocrat, for example, wearing jewelry or better clothes or whatever. Everybody is naked. So it's a perfect equality again. The only condition is that you are Greek and you are a free person. So, and you can participate. And of course, you have to be male in order to participate in the Olympics. But we know there were also some games where women could also participate, but this is another question. So there again, you have the third influence, the third factor, which again promotes equality. And the last one is the city-state environment. You have small, in most cases, even in the bigger one, as Josiah said before about Syracuse or Athens and so on, or Sparta, which were relatively bigger states. But anyway, the center of the state is actually the city, and we have the marketplace, and everybody meets more or less in the marketplace. So in most cases, we have really face-to-face societies. But even when you don't have that, you have a place where most people meet each other, speak to each other, and so on. And this again promotes solves also the problem of how to coordinate, for example, a revolution, which we come next to that. So this particular environment of the city-state is also a factor which is a precondition for the establishment of democracy. So actually, in order to recapitulate, we have 4 factors: phalanx, military, the art of war, which is unique in the Greek states. Second, religion, which is again unique in the Greek states. Third, Olympic sports, which is again unique for the Greek states, and the face-to-face society in the polis environment. And this, we think, are the necessary conditions, but not yet sufficient conditions for the establishment of democracy. The sufficient conditions are, of course, the existence of particular circumstances, the great man, if you may say so. And in the case of Athens, we have, of course, Clisthenes, who initiates a revolution, which is based on the factors which we said before, and this establishes the democracy. I want also to say something a little bit about the fleet, since we are speaking about on the occasion of the 2,500 years of Salamis. I said before that the phalanx is a very tight cooperation mechanism, but the trireme is even more so because it is a cooperation, a coordination mechanism which allows the cooperation and coordination of different if we may say so, of different kinds of warriors. You have the rowers. We have in one trireme, we have 170 rowers. We have the hoplites, which are the marines. We are 12 on the ship. We have the archers, 4 of them, and we have also 7 or 8 sailors and the officers. Those are very different classes. The rowers are the thieves, which are the poor ones. The others are more or less middle ones. And the officers and the triarch, who is the nominal commander of the ship, is a very rich Athenian because he has to bear the liturgy of the running expenses of the ship, which are very, very high. So in order for the ship to function well, you have to coordinate and to cooperate with various groups. But this again, if you transport it then in the working of democracy, you learn on the ships and on the fleets, of course, because the ship is one part of the fleet. The fleet is the big part of many ships. You learn to coordinate and cooperate. You learn also something else. You learn to follow the expert, which is very important again for the politics after that. You have to follow the officers, you have to follow the expert who is the man who runs the ship, not the triarch, but the real captain of the ship. And you have to follow the advice of them. You cannot do whatever you like because you know they know how to run the ship, when you have to run the oars, when you have to run the sails and so on, when you have to increase speed in order to run the enemy ship and so on. Now, if you transfer all this which you have learned on the phalanx and on the ships, you have something which we call a mechanism which is well known both in economics but also in political science and in psychology. We have what we say the bounded rationality. Bounded rationality means that since the brain of a normal man has not an unlimited capacity, you try to transport things which you have learned in some area in order to solve a problem which appears in another area. Very simple. The values which you have learned on, for example, the field of battle, the phalanx and the ships, which, as I said before, are equality, courage, follow the expert, self-confidence, trust, and so on, you transfer them in the democratic process. So you say, if, for example, the man who stands next to me in the phalanx or rows the ship next to me on the trireme, I'm willing to listen to him and to consider him as an equal. But it is, of course, the principle of equality which is transferred in democracy. And the democracy of ancient Athens, as we know, is, of course, a direct democracy. And the second one which you learn is, of course, trust. You trust the man who fights with you. The third one is that you follow the expert. You have learned to follow the expert on the field of battle, either the general or the triarch or the general who is also the naval commander. And then, of course, you have learned to follow the expert also in the ship or in the assembly. And also, for example, we say that there is a myth why Pericles was wearing always, you know, the helmet. As we have seen him picture, or as well, the historians picture him. What we think is that what he wanted to show to the Athenians in the assembly is that you have to trust your general, because as we know, Pericles was also a general. And well, he was not a brilliant commander, but he had fought as a general, elected general of the Athenians. And so he wanted probably to remind them also that, you know, don't forget that you are our general. And we have also very many examples also of military experts who after that, not only in Greece, but in other cases, which became, of course, politicians and presidents of the democracy. For example, George Washington was the first one, but he was not the only one. Ulysses Grant, Andrew Jackson, to say the American history, and many other, Wellington in England and so on in Great Britain. So what we wanted to say in brief, so that we have time, is that the bounded rationality mechanism helps to transport what we have learned in the field of battle into the democracy, and the values which we have learned there, you transfer them in the field of democracy. So this is what we think in a very brief outline, how democracy and why democracy was established and created first in Athens, and of course, similarly in other city-states. And I don't want to take more time, so that we have a little bit of time for discussion and questions if you want. Thank you very much.
Okay. Are there any questions from the audience? George? Not yet. Okay, well, that's a persuasive argument, I think. Did you make?
Thank you. And well, of course, as we know, after that, we hope to collect all the interventions and to publish a good book. So we have there more time and more space to develop all arguments, not only ours, I mean, everybody's argument.
So you want everyone's presentations?
Pardon me, Josh? I'm not hearing you.
Josh, you're muted. We don't hear you.
No.
For some reason, you're mute. If you go down to the little at the bottom of the screen, there you can see how to unmute.
No, we don't hear you, Josh.
Fourth button to the left, the green button.
If you go to the commands at the bottom of the screen, there are several commands, right? There's one in the middle, fourth from the left, is a lancet. If there's a red line through it, then you push on that to unmute it. These are the pandemic experiences.
Indeed.
We all have to learn how to mute, unmute. Josh, you need to refresh the page. Or at least that's what I'm told. Okay. So what did you think, Alan?
Yeah, I think that I liked a lot this presentation. It's the question of the background of democracy. Democracy is not. We should have the big picture, the broad view to understand democracy. And as you said, thinking of the way, let's say, the role of religion, the way religion is conceived in ancient Greece, the fact can even democratic development, but you can discuss the gods on stage. You can discuss the role, or even already in the Iliad, the gods are very close. You can discuss that. It leaves a space open for discussion. I liked also what you said about the part to Olympic Games. So all kinds of well beyond strictly the democratic framework, there are ways of participation, of equal participation in Greece that let's say paved the way for democracy. Democracy doesn't come from nowhere suddenly. It has even if indeed it's only at the end of the 6th century that democracy develops. I think it's very important to acknowledge this. I would even emphasize also the economic side, because it's something that interests me a lot, and the fact that Greek communities were open to contacts with a lot of different partners. Their traders communicated with a lot of different cities, Greek cities, but also so-called barbarian other cultures. And so this gave them an opportunity always to discuss, to confront what they were, what they had developed, and to to have a representation of what they actually were doing. And this helps to understand democracy a lot. Democracy should not be restricted only to the limited sphere of politics. Otherwise, we can't understand how democracy came into being. But now there is another side. I would like maybe to come back to Josh's paper. Also, it connects with Josh's paper, which is the question of rationality of decision. And you explain that it was a very risky decision to fight the on paper. It was pure madness. The unbalance so much that they had no chance to defeat the Persians, at least on paper. It's a succession of fortunate developments and very wise tactics and strategy that helped them finally. But on paper, they should have been defeated. This is the case where on paper there was no doubt. And the question is, what in this case? It's rational to make a decision. The process of decision making is rational. When the risks are high, when apparently you fight with almost not a single chance to be victorious, is it rational to go to war? I want just to provoke you on this.
Yes. Can you hear me now? Am I
Yes.
now?
I can hear you.
Good.
Yes.
So here's if we think about formal rationality, then we have to ask, is it possible for a group to form preferences and to have coherent beliefs? So that's one of the big questions that I'm arguing, yes, it is possible for a group the size of an Athenian assembly to in fact form preferences and have beliefs about the state of the world that are at least coherent. If that's true, then the question is can this group have its beliefs be as reality tracking enough to capture something like the probability of different outcomes, the likelihood of different outcomes? And can they have their preferences be organized in a way that they can actually think about what would be our top order, our most preferred option, and then going on down? So I suppose that the Athenians could do both of these things. They could order their preferences, and they had reasonably coherent beliefs, reality tracking enough so that they could form some idea of likelihoods. Now, their first preference, I assume, would be just to have the Persians go away, but that was not possible. So they can't have that, and they know that. And so, if the Persians are going to come down and attack them, then they really come down to these three possible options. Either they all try to run away to the west, or they fight on the Acropolis, or they fight with their warships. And at that point, you have to think of, well, what is the value of each of these options to them, and then what is the probability of the option, working out? And I think in this point, the Athenians thought, well, yes, very likely Alain is right. The probability of winning with the warships is not very high, but the probability of winning, holding off in the Acropolis is so minuscule as to be, simply written off. And then you have to think of what is the value of fleeing to the west. And I think that one way to think about that is fleeing to the west would not bring the whole Athenian community along. I mean, you got whoever number of people you could get on, whatever ships you could put together. You can't simply move the entire polis to the west. So it would mean giving up thousands and thousands of Athenians to basically be destroyed by the Persians. And I think at that point, the value of that option was simply too low, even though it would probably work. They probably could get thousands of Athenians evacuated to some place in the Western Mediterranean. It was felt that for the community as a whole, that was really very low value. Of the options, probability times value of outcome, fight at Salamis is the highest, even though it's super high risk, right? It still is the rational choice.
Yes. Okay, I think that's your answer. That in fact, there are no choice. There are no real choice but to fight. The conclusion of the debate was that the other offer had so negative results that even if the stake in the chance to win was low, it was even better than fleeing to the west, because a large part of the community will remain behind and will be destroyed, or fight in Athens, which would be complete nonsense. So, yeah.
Yeah, so rationality doesn't mean take the option that is going to be a sure thing. We so seldom have sure thing options before us. And when we have a sure thing option, sometimes it's not a very good sure thing. So rationality just requires probability times value of outcome if it comes true.
But I think also, if I may say that Josh puts forward a very, very interesting and important issue, which is not just the issue of how to rationalize if we must fight as Athenians and Salamis, Greeks and Salamis, but a major issue which I think has not been examined sufficiently by economists and political scientists and so on, is how different is the formation of preference under direct democracy, of which we are speaking now, and representative democracy. And there we have, for example, the famous arrow possibility or impossibility theorem, as we call it in economics. And I have the suspicion, and we are working on that now, that if you change the institutional setup and you go from representative democracy to direct democracy, as in the Athenian Assembly, yet possibly you may find a solution of ranking preferences, because there, actually what you do is you don't decide on a whole issue or list of preferences as in representative democracy, but case by case. And then you start from bottom up, say, for example, okay, what shall we do in defense? Okay, vote, this is the defense issue and decision. What shall we do in economics? This one and so on. And if you aggregate then from bottom up to the top, perhaps you find a solution to the arrow possibility theorem. I'm not sure yet, but we have some ideas that perhaps the institutional setup gives a different outcome for the arrow theorem.
If you look at some recent work by Professor Mirko Canavero at University of Edinburgh, Canavero has argued, I think, quite persuasively, that in most Athenian assembly debates, the goal was to discover the option that can gain near consensus, indeed perhaps perfect consensus. And the whole mechanism that Canavero suggests for the ways in which options were presented to the assembly basically aims at finding the option that can gain that near consensus. So as soon as you've got that, as soon as the idea is driving for consensus rather than just a plurality of votes on multiple options, as with arrows, impossibility theorem, then you really have solved that problem. So I think that's exactly, your intuition is exactly right, Nicholas. that the direct democracy does have in its procedural form really quite different way of making judgments on particular issues. It does make the judgment on individual issues, and the goal is to get as close to consensus as possible on each individual issue. And this really gets rid of the problem of the impossibility, the aggregation question, through voting, which of course is what Arrow's theorem is about.
Okay. Well, we don't have any questions from the audience. Unless one of you wants to make another point, I think can.
Just one final point about Nicolas' very interesting presentation is that if we think about Cleisthenes' reform of the tribes, of the Fulai, it goes exactly to what you were saying. Because, of course, when you have a new identity as a member of one of the 10 tribes, that identity is a political identity, so you are represented in the council by your tribe. It's also a military identity. You fight beside your fellow tribesmen in the infantry, at any rate. It's also a ritual and festival identity, because in the Dionysia festival, your tribe is represented by your dancing troupe, your chorus. And so it's exactly this overlapping of identities, I think, that goes to your behavioral economics idea, that what you learn as a soldier and what you learn in the festival and what you learn in engaging as a citizen are all mutually reinforcing, and it helps you to be more skillful in each of those activities because you're borrowing from these different domains.
Thank you, Josh.
Right.
That was the point that I was trying to make when the mute button stopped working.
Right. Okay. And does anyone else want to add a final point? Then I think we can conclude this session. I think it was very interesting. I saw some very new perspectives that I hadn't seen before. So I enjoyed it. And I hope our viewers enjoyed it as well. All right.
Thank
you.
Thank you for sharing for us, and it is delightful to be in the presence of such great scholars.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Jorgo.
Since we are doing, enter your question in the chat. So our first speaker is Professor Sarah Forsdyke. Professor Forsdyke is Professor of Classics and History at the University of Michigan, and she's going to speak about the impact of the Battle of Salamis on the development of the jury courts at Athens. Professor Forsdyke, you have the floor is yours. Professor Sarah Forsdyke. Professor Forsdyke is Professor of Classics and History at the University of Michigan, and she's going to speak about the impact of the Battle of Salamis on the development of the jury courts at Athens. Professor Forsdyke, you have the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Irene.
Περίμενε, γιατί αυτή δεν έχει καλό ήχο.
Then Professor of Classics and History at the University of Michigan, and she's going to speak about the impact of the Battle of Salamis on the development of the jury courts at Athens. Professor Forsdyke, you have the floor is yours.
Is this better? Can you hear me?
Περίμενε, γιατί αυτή δεν έχει καλό ήχο.
Can I go ahead? I guess I just go ahead. Give me the thumbs up and I go ahead.
Professor Forsdyke, you have the floor is yours.
Okay, well, I will start. I'm hoping that I'm supposed to. So as they said, I'm going to talk about the Battle of Salamis and its effect on the development of the jury court at Athens. So could I have slide 1 of my presentation, please? There is an issue. Okay. Okay. I guess I've been told that I cannot have these slide PowerPoint presentation that I was expecting to use. So I'll just go ahead and talk to you, and I hope it's clear enough. So it's long been recognized that the great naval victory of the Athenians at Salamis furthered the democratization of Athens by demonstrating the importance of the poorest Athenians to the military strength of Athens. Even ancient commentators, notably the anonymous author known as the Old Oligarch, recognized the connection between sea power and democracy. Indeed, despite his evident hostility to democracy, the Old Oligarch observes that it is right that the poor and the ordinary people in Athens should have more power than the noble and the rich, because it is the ordinary people who row the ships and bring the city her power. And it is the helmsmen, the boatswains, the junior officers, the lookouts, the shipwrights who make the city powerful, much more than the hoplites and the noble and respectable citizens. This being so, it seems that all should share in public office by lot and by election, and that any citizen who wishes should be able to speak in the assembly. So my goal in this paper is to focus on one aspect of this process of democratization, the strengthening of the popular juries, and to highlight the revolutionary nature of the changes in the judicial system that took place in the decades following Salamis. In short, I will be arguing that these changes represent the full realization of two key aspects of democracy that are fundamental to democracy even today: the equal protection of the law for all citizens and the engagement of citizens in democratic self-rule. I will begin with a short overview of the development of the jury courts at Athens before turning to the broader significance of these developments for democratic rule. So, the jury trial originates with Solon, who granted appeals to the Popular Assembly against decisions made by judicial magistrates. While there is no time to dwell on this revolutionary step, it is worth noting that Solon already seems to recognize the implications of this innovation for securing the equal protection of the law. And I quote Solon here, "I wrote laws for the powerful and the weak alike, making justice fair for each." While Solon made the assembly into a court of appeal, the popular courts, or the dicasteria, were created probably around the time of Cleisthenes, since they exist already at the time of the Persian Wars, according to the author of the Aristotelian Constitution of Athens. It's likely, therefore, that the popular courts were created by Cleisthenes as part of his democratic reforms of 508-7. Aristotle, in his work The Politics, equates the creation of the popular courts with the establishment of democracy, although he mistakenly attributes the development to Solon rather than to Cleisthenes. The author of the Constitution of the Athenians similarly equates the juries with democracy when he writes, "When the people have power over the judicial vote, they hold power in the state." For our purposes today, developments in the decades after the Battle of Salamis are crucial. In these decades, there were two key changes. First, in 462, Ephialtes introduced a set of reforms that centered on stripping the Areopagus of its additional powers and the redistribution of these powers among the Council of 500, the Assembly, and the jury courts. Although we have frustratingly little evidence for the specific powers that were granted to the jury courts, it's likely that it entailed granting them jurisdiction over all cases except homicide cases, a prerogative that we know was retained by the Areopagus after the reforms. With the exception of homicide cases, the jury courts became the primary locus for the regulation of justice, a key step that not only advanced the realization of the equal protection of the law for high and low alike, but also created a need for the full participation of the people in the administration of justice. The next important development seems to respond directly to this last point. In 450 BCE, Pericles introduced jury pay for jury service, therefore ensuring that ordinary citizens, as opposed to the well-off, could participate on juries. The inclusion of ordinary citizens on the jury rolls seems to have been the main effect of this reform and would have ensured that not only there were enough volunteers to man the courts, 6,000 were needed each year, but that disputes were viewed from diverse perspectives, a key condition for just decision-making and the equal protection of the law, as we'll see. So these two changes in the 460s and 450s seem to have paved the way for the full empowerment of the jury courts as a central component of the Athenian democracy. Indeed, by the time of Aristophanes' comedies, The Clouds and the Wasps of 423 and 422, the popular law courts are so prominent in Athenian democratic culture that a character can complain that a map of Athens is inaccurate because the law courts are not visible. And a whole comedy can be written parodying the jurors as doddering old fools. We have to wait until the last third of the 4th century, however, for the Aristotelian explication of the complex and sophisticated workings of the law courts under the democracy. There can be no doubt from the Aristotelian account, however, that the popular juries were the principal locus for the administration of justice in classical Athens. Now, I want to make 2 points about the revolutionary nature of the fully empowered jury courts in Athens following the Battle of Salamis. First, a truly popular jury means that disputes are viewed from diverse perspectives, and therefore decisions are not only more just, but provide equal protection of the law for all citizens, high and low alike, as Solon put it. Secondly, a truly popular jury not only grants equal dignity to citizens, but also allows citizens to gain experience in interpreting and applying the law, and thereby becoming actively engaged in the practice of democracy. Let me elaborate briefly on each of these points. In classical Athens, the jury trial was considered to be vital to the equal protection of the law, since juries of ordinary citizens would tend to view a dispute and interpret the law from the point of view of an ordinary citizen as opposed to the powerful. In this sense, for the Athenians, the judicial system with its large juries of ordinary citizens was a key mark of the difference between democracy and tyranny. In legal disputes under democratic rule, as the Athenian historian Thucydides wrote, there is equality for all according to the laws. The Athenian tragedian Euripides echoes this sentiment when he observed that while a tyrant controls the law and denies citizens equality before the law, in a democracy, quote, the weak and the wealthy have equal justice. But the equal protection of the law is not the only justification for the jury in ancient Athens. Indeed, our sources implicitly and sometimes explicitly recognize service on a jury as a key feature of democratic citizenship. That is to say that service on a jury was important not just for ensuring justice for defendants, but also for the community's right to participate actively in politics as a citizen of democracy. But why is judicial power so crucial to political power? And specifically, why is jury service so critical to democracy? There are several reasons for this tight association, beyond the point already made that juries serve as a check on the arbitrary exercise of power by individuals. First, jury service embodies the democratic principle that each citizen has equal capacity to form a judgment and thereby is granted equal dignity as a citizen. Secondly, service on the jury allows citizens to learn about the laws and gain practical experience in applying them in particular situations. In doing so, jurors become educated in the norms and practices of democracy as they collectively decide what is just. One of the ancient slogans about democracy was that it embodied the principle of ruling and being ruled in turn. It might equally have been judge and be judged in turn. In ancient Athens, each year, 6,000 jurors, approximately 1/5 of the male citizen population, listened to cases being argued and were required to weigh arguments and make judgments about the application of the law. Litigants frequently claimed that they taught the citizens of the jury about the law, but it's equally true that, with no judges and other legal experts present, the jurors themselves ultimately decided which laws were relevant to a case and how they should be interpreted. While this description might suggest that there was a great deal of legal uncertainty in the ancient Athenian system, in fact, fairness and reasonable consistency were achieved because decisions rested with such a large representative subsection of the population. In addition, jurors knew that they could be judged by their peers in the future and thus were loath to impose unfair judgments on their fellow citizens. Moreover, before even embarking on jury service, jurors were required to swear an oath on penalty of divine retribution to listen to both sides of the case impartially and to judge cases according to the law. So summing up, In conclusion, it's right to celebrate the breakthrough of democracy following the Battle of Salamis. The key role of ordinary and poor citizens in the Greek victory at Salamis set up the conditions for the inclusion of all Athenian males in the exercise of democratic citizenship. But in closing, we should acknowledge that slaves also served as rowers, not to mention hoplites, in Greek warfare by the 430s at the latest, and probably much earlier. Michael Jameson pointed out already in the 1960s that in order to man 200 ships, you need about 37,000 to 43,000 males. And that would have been impossible to recruit from the citizen population alone. So there's even a bit later, we know that there are lists of men serving in the Athenian Navy from 410 to 390 BC, and they reveal that between 20 and 40% of the crew of each ship was composed of slaves. Yet the Athenians never granted slaves political and legal rights in return for this service. So the Athenian democracy had its limits, and the equal dignity gained by citizen rowers was not extended to the many who deserved it. And this is not even to mention Athenian women who, although they didn't row at Salamis, were, at least from a modern perspective, equally worthy of full political rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Forsyth, for your inspiring presentation. More takeaway, but okay, I note just one argument that the trial by jury is essential, not just for the equal protection before the law, but also for the engagement of citizens in their democracy. And with that, I will give the floor to Professor Edith Hall, Professor of Classics at King's College, London. Professor Hall is going to speak about the rowing and the democratic memory, Salamis in Aristophanic comedy. Professor Hall.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the lovely invitation. So the constitution of the Athenians attributed to the old oligarch and Thucydides are our two witnesses to the fundamental importance of sea power and thus of rowing to the Athenian imperial democracy. The maritime supremacy was launched during the Persian Wars, and Salamis became its symbol. I'm going to start using the PowerPoint now, but we'll return to you at the end of the talk. God, sorry, you're famous. So they can see. Okay, I need to go on to the next one. My colleague at King's College London, Professor of War Studies, Andrew Lambert, has written in his book Sea Power Studies, a Pericles speech of 432, in Thucydides' carefully chosen words, Salamis becomes the defining moment of cultural transformation. Themistocles' revolutionary concept reinvented the staid, landed city of Athens, a city that considered Marathon the acme of glory as the imperial metropolis of a unique sea empire. In Thomas Hobbes' translations, the Athenians abandoned their city, went a shipboard, and became seamen. Yet signs of that alleged cultural change, at least until Aristophanes, are very hard to identify. I asked today why there's so little recognition in classical Athenian art that Athenian power was based on the millions of oar strokes made by her large class of professional oarsmen, many of whom lived in the harbour area of Piraeus or on Salamis Island itself. Their champion was Pericles, and yet you could never tell from the sculptures of the Acropolis temples he commissioned that the sovereign power, Kratos, lay with the democratic majority of lower-class rowers rather than with hoplites or cavalrymen. There were, however, subcutaneous complements to sea power in the overall Acropolis experience. When the visitor enters the Propylae from the east, they can see the mountains and the centre of the island of Salamis. But when they exit, almost all the island has come within their sightline. And the massive statue of Athena in hoplite gear, later named Athena Promachos, stood 30 foot high between the Propylae and the Parthenon. She was set up there in 456 BCE and commemorated actually the land battle of Marathon. But Pausanias pointed out that she speaks loud to sailors, and she served as a sea mark, helping ships to steer towards the city. There are also a very tiny number of artifacts referring to maritime warfare. 2 wine cups have personifications of Salamis painted on them with her name inscribed, but with no really explicit reference to seafaring. And amongst the smaller Acropolis fragments, one shows a male figure holding an aphlaston, the beak of a conquered ship, being crowned by either Athena or Nike, victory. And a fragment of a tiny shield, a votive shield, shows a beautiful Nike with an aphlaston in each hand. And 2 larger vases made in Athens portray Athena and another Poseidon wielding an aphlaston. But these are very slim pickings, perhaps used in very private symposia or individual inexpensive dedications. So the visual artistic record would give us little suggestion of the millions of oar strokes made by Athenian men during the imperial period, carefully synchronized by the Keleustes, boatswain, and the penetrating rhythm of an aulos. But in 5 of Aristophanes' plays, we have intense discussion of rowing affairs designed to flatter the majority in the audience that Aristophanes needed to applaud if he were to win the drama competition. So it's from comedy that we even know what the orders given by the Keleustes sounded like, and it was "ooh up," and the antiphonal responses of the oarsmen "up up up pie." But the only reason we know those noises is because they occur in Aristophanic comedy. Our definition of the rower called the thalamax also depends on jokes in Aristophanes. In Frogs, a man called Paralos, probably a member of the clan Paraloi who manned the sacred trireme Paralos, farts into the face of the thalamax. And this proves the presence of more than one level in the ship. Also in Aristophanes' piece, Irene, Trygaius seats himself on the cuirass, pushes his arms through both its armholes, which he calls the thalamiae, and wipes his bottom with both hands. The arms manufacturer finds this odd, implying that he doesn't understand the comparison with the thalamax's distinctive use of 2 oars, insisting that nobody uses 2 hands on the toilet. But this joke occurs in a Dionysia comedy, where rowing otherwise features hardly at all. It's from Aristophanic plays written for the Linnaea festival, where comic competitions were probably introduced between 444 and 441, that we derive our understanding of the centrality of rowing to the Athenian psyche. Neither comedy dating from the 4th century, assembly women and wealth shows much interest in rowing. But in all 4 of the 5th century plays we know for certain were performed at the Linnaea, which was for residents of Attica only and not for the allies. In all 4 of those plays, extended sequences show an intimate acquaintance with rowing in the audience. And these were surely designed to please that audience majority that Aristophanes needed to applaud his play. The many professional rowers of Athens will not have been away on ships at the time of the Linnaea, a midwinter festival outside the sailing season. In Acharnians, there are several possible allusions to Aeschylus' Persians, the most famous Salamis text of all. The assumption that the audience contains experienced rowers is made by Dicaeopolis when he's talking both to Pseudo-Artabas and to the Thracian ambassador. Theorus says that the Odomantians, if paid 2 drachmas, will be mercenaries for the Athenians. But Dicaeopolis responds, 2 drachmae to those circumcised men? The Thranite people who save our city, the Thranitis Leos or Sosipolis, own land. The Thranite with the
Can I have IT support, please? Hello? So I'm afraid that we cannot hear Professor Hall, and in this case, no, I don't have IT support. I cannot have IT support. Hello? Hello, Dimitra. Can you help us? Professor Holler and Professor Ullman, are you on the screen? Can you hear me? Hello?
Can you hear us? Can you hear us?
Yes, yes. Now I can hear.
You can see us.
Hello.
Hear us.
Hello.
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 Very good.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay.
There was some trouble all the time here, you know.
Yes, there is some trouble because maybe it's Sunday, so why there is a problem because of the day. I'm very sorry about Professor Hall. Can you hear me? We will make just a last effort. Professor Hall, can you hear me?
Yeah. No. Can you hear me?
She can't hear us.
You cannot hear us.
I'm talking to Professor Hall, Edith Hall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can hear you. You see, we are here up here somewhere. Yeah.
Okay.
And we can hear you. But can you hear us?
And Mrs. Barbara Ullman?
Yes, I'm here as well, and I can hear as well.
Okay, perfect. Professor Holler, Emeritus Professor of Economics, University of Hamburg, and Professor Ullman, Munich Institute for Integrated Studies. They are going to speak together. They are going to do this, to make this presentation together, and they are going to speak about the topic, the demos and Adigoni. which is a very special, a very interesting topic. The floor is yours.
Much.
Professor Kohler.
Thank you.
This is where are we? Okay. So I'm Creon, king of Thebes or Thebes, whatever you call it, Thebes. And this here is Antigone. Can you see Antigone? No, not really. Here you can see her. Yeah. Okay. Can you hear us? Can you see us? Okay. This is gonna be our presentation. Well, you cannot see it. You know, we just got this computer fixed. No, you cannot see it. So the story is it's the Demos and a paper with George Tridimas from Ulster University. In this paper, we analyze, you know, Antigone's trap, or we call it trap. The question is she trapped by Creon, or is she actually trapping Creon? Now, what is the issue anymore? That's the question. So Antigone is here, and as you may know, Antigone is the daughter of Oedipus and Iocasta, and she is the sister of Eteocles and Polynicus and Ismene, and Polynicus and Eteocles think there's now I talk on the screen, but I'm not talking now.
Yes, you are.
Am I talking? The screen is talking. our story in paper is actually that Antigone herself, tried, to create, you could say, a scandal, by going in trap of Creon, but then trapping Creon by addressing the demos, the well, so to say. She wanted, to use her position to get rid of Creon, and or at least to get something like the kingship of or queenship of Thebes. So there was this kind of conflict in interest, of course, and it was Haemon, the son of Creon and the fiancé of Antigone, who referred, say, to the demos. If, well, Antigone, so to say, getting punished by stoning, or what was later done by putting into a rocky vault, then the people in Thebes will not support this, Haemon said. And now Antigone will do the kind of present this kind of dialogue between Haemon, the son of Creon, and Creon, the king of Thebes. Okay.
Yes.
Antigone, go ahead. Well, this is.
So I'm not only Antigone, hello, but also Haemon. So Haemon is talking to Creon and also to the chorus, that is the demos, then later. And I quote a few lines from a translation by Jepp, so an older translation, which was also used by.
Well, anyway, Jepp is very close to Hölderlin, and Hölderlin did a translation in 1804, and there are scholars in who can obviously read this kind of German, and they think it's representing very well actually what Sophocles has written. So this is the basic assumption. That's why we use Jepp.
Oh, so okay, Haemon talking to Creon tells him, "I can hear these murmurs in the dark, the moanings of the city for this maiden. No woman, they say, ever merited her dues. None ever was to die so shamefully for so glorious as hers." Well, Creon answers, "Is it a merit to honor the unruly?" Haemon, "I could wish no one to show respect for evildoers." Creon, "Then is not she tainted with that malady? Haemon, "Our Theban folk with one voice denies it." Creon, "Shall Thebes prescribe to me how I must rule?" That is a bit later than the dialogue just now. Creon, "Am I to rule this land by other judgment than mine own?" Haemon, "That is no city which belongs to one man." Creon, "Is not the city held to be the ruler's?" Haemon, "Thou wouldst make a good monarch of a desert."
Yeah. So this is, of to the hidden conflict in the society, reference to demos or the people, or it's not explicit, but anyway. So he wants to convince his father, not to punish Antigone, but his father is unconvinced. And so the story goes on, Antigone is in conversation with Creon, and there's a lot of kind of historical reference and so on. But then Antigone starts to be explicit in a way. She addresses the elders of Thebes. And the elders represent, so to say, the demos. And the idea is, that she tries, to convince the elders that she is the right governor or prince of Thebes. Now, in what Antigone will read now, she addresses herself as a princess, at least later. But in fact, in Hölderlin, she uses the expression that she is the queen. And that has to do again with this epicleros constitutional rule, that in fact she represents the royal family of Oedipus. Now we have the first Antigone quote, where she refers to the city, and as a citizen, and she tries, to get, so to say, the support of these people, and then, to get, Creon to step down or to run away or whatever. Antigone is.
See me, citizens of my fatherland, setting forth on my last way, looking my last on the sunlight that is for me no more. No, Hades, who gives sleep to all, leads me living to Acheron's shore, who have had no portion in the chant that brings the bride, nor has any song been mine for the crowning of brides, whom the Lord of the dark lake shall wed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to mention, that in the meantime, Creon more attention to have a pardon. The argument that was afraid, if there's public stoning, then the people of Thebes might support Antigone, might save her, or at least he gets a very, very bad reputation. So his intention was, and that comes out of these words, his intention was to bring Antigone to what he calls a rocky vault, to a cave, and then lock her there. And in fact, what is interesting is that he wanted to give food with her. And there is a little sentence that says, that he doesn't want to be responsible for the death of Antigone. So, or the city should be responsible. And this has changed. He understood the message, the power of the demos. And so he became more careful in being, so to say, public judge, so to say, representative. He wanted to be more careful. And now Antigone tries again to address the demos or the elders of Thebes, and that means the chorus in this context. So, Barbara?
Well, Antigone. O city of my fathers in the land of Thebes, O ye gods, eldest of our race, they lead me hence, now they tarry not. Behold me, princess of Thebes, the last daughter of the house of your. See what I suffer, and from whom, because I fear to cast away the fear of heaven.
Okay, so what did the chorus do? No, the chorus did not help her, did not react to that. Actually, the chorus tells stories about other women, mostly, who were locked up, and had to suffer of injustice, but they had to suffer it. And this was the immediate response of the chorus. So there was a problem, And in fact, that Antigone was led to this cave, and in the cave she was locked, and yeah, that was, so to say, in the meanwhile, that was the first result. Now, Tiresias the seer came, and there was a bit of worried conversation because Creon was not thinking highly or not talking highly about knowing the seers. He said, well, you're paid more or less. But then the conversation became more serious. And in the end, Creon was convinced, that he has done something wrong. So he decided to go to the cave, and well, actually what he decided was that he asked the chorus. Now, I forgot this. He asked the chorus, what shall I do? So the kind of relationships have changed. And the chorus said, you go to the cave and you free Antigone. So he went to the cave, or he asked actually to open the cave, and and then he went there, and there was already the voice of Haemon, and what they saw was that Antigone hanged herself. And so Haemon wanted to kill his father, but he missed it with his sword, so he hurt him with the sword, and so he killed himself. And then yeah, all the story was then Eurydice killed herself. This was the wife of Creon, and so on. Now, but what is interesting is, the function of the demos and the reference to the demos in this context, and it's just a strong, focus point, or the focal point for some of the underlying streams of this play. It's more obvious, when you read the Hölderlin. Now, what's about Hölderlin? This translation was done in 1804. Hölderlin was very fluent in the Old Greek language, talked even to his colleague, friend, to Hegel in Old Greek, it's said, but then in 1806 he was declared mad and locked away. But in 1884 he did this translation, and it's an interesting translation. It's very inspiring. And as I said, Chep is a translation of Richard Chep is very close to it. Other translations are very far away from it, and so we don't know really, how strong the reference to Demos is. If this is in, forget about this other translation for the moment. Now, for us, it's interesting, that now in the original version, the paper which I did with George Striedemus was, this kind of trapping. Creon tried to, obviously, when he did this degree, we were thinking of Antigone burying Polynicus, and so he expected that Antigone will do it. And Antigone probably went into this trap, and that's our hypothesis, because she wanted to, she relied on the demos and wanted to get rid of her uncle Creon in that way. The result was actually that Antigone killed herself too quickly, because otherwise, she could have been saved, and probably she could have been queen, as she called herself in the translation of Hölderlin. This is the story, and this we want to continue in our research, and I very much hope that the paper with George Striedemus on Antigone's traps, will come out in the German Greek yearbook of political economy, where it's accepted and already typeset. Well, thank you very much. I have to mention that we had very serious technical problems here, and we were not sure, that we can make it. Thank you.
We got it. Thank you. Thank you very much for this very fascinating presentation. We know by history that Antigone's action was motivated by the desire to follow something more powerful than political authority. And for her, religious laws were superior to political ones. And this is the motivation for her to go against the system. Professor Hall, we lost contact with you. Oh, I was thinking that we can reconnect with Mrs. Hall, Mrs. Edith Hall. She was on the screen. We lost contact for a second time, and let me proceed to our speaker, last speaker, Mr. Professor Guy Faux Delacroix. He's Doctor honoris causa at the University of Thessaly, and former embassy minister and member of the Cologne Chamber of Lawyers. Professor Faux Delacroix is going to speak about democracy in ancient and modern times and normative appraisal. Mr. Delacroix, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and greatest greetings to my lady fellow panelists and also to all other conference participants. I hope one day, when this cauchemar is all over, we shall meet in person. And we still have a chance, because the real anniversary is, of course, next year in September 2021. So we still have another year to prepare for the great celebration. Personally, this history of the Salamis and Democracy Conference goes back to more than 10 years. At that time, in our group of friends in Athens, we were concerned with the celebration for the 2500th anniversary of Marathon. And we were at the time appointed by the lack of interest on the side of the authority. A small group of friends managed to do a few things, like organizing a symposium in the European Parliament and a Marathon 2500 assembly in Athens. Probably the most lasting and important result of these efforts is the Marathon 2005 declaration. And we achieved this text in a long and lively debate, sometimes, and we downloaded in normative terms what we thought were the lessons to be learned from history. So you have 21 articles in which we expressed and said what we thought we learned from history for our own times. I will completely resist the temptation to give you a lecture of this text, but alternative and approach to the issue. Without Marathon, we're not who we are. I voted myself in the introduction to the Marathon 2500 declaration. And the same is now to be heard, obviously, 10 years later in the ceremonial speeches on the 2500th anniversary of the Salamis. In fact, however, the thesis of ancient democracy as being an indispensable prerequisite for our own, its interpretation as a sine qua non definitely needs to be re-examined. How Greek is our democratic identity? Let us not overlook the doubts about the shaping of our democracies by Greek history, which, for example, we find in a completely different non-European perspective. School of critical of Eurocentrism, often with a tenor of bitter accusation. A representative of this school of thought is, for example, Amartya Sen, and the Eurocentric derivative of democracy, from that perspective, ignores completely the multiple models of democracy that have emerged in other regions in human history, for example, in India. Now, and then there is another counter thesis like proposed today, and that is that, in fact, democracy is a necessity and doesn't need a model. It didn't need the mold of the ancient democracy. We could call it the theory of democratic materialism. Democracy as being something natural, or an Überbau, a superstructure for the of industrial relations in modernity. Now, if we look at the history of ideas in the modern age, obviously we can't ignore Renaissance and Enlightenment and their references to the antique experience. But is that enough to establish a historical causality for modern democracy? Such a general historical causality is, of course, still far from confirming specifically the ancient democracy acted as a mold for our modern societies, that the founding fathers of our democracy were led by the ancient model. We are most likely to find such an orientation in the American Revolution, with the founding fathers of the United States. The classicist architecture of the US Congress and many US government buildings, up down to the local post office, is to the day evidence of awareness. As for continental Europe, we in the French Revolution a brief and almost obsessive flirtation of the Jacobins with the Athenian Republic before the Empire, and soon of the Roman Republic, and soon of the Roman Empire prevailed. For the peoples who had suffered from the imperial campaigns of Napoleon Bonaparte, rule, democracy was regarded as an aberration of the revolution. It was held to be thoroughly discredited by the Terror and remained a horror for decades of restoration. In the German Empire, the aversion to ancient Greek democracy continued. Anyway, certainly in the conservative attitude of monarchists, but also in the distance of liberal scholars felt towards that democracy. For the 19th and 20th century liberals, the offense lay in their observation, I believe correct observation, that a democracy had developed less from the ideal of the free human being, but rather from a series of political reforms that gradually moved towards increasing equality. The historical momentum lay in the need for egalitarian approach. I'm not entirely alone in the perception that this liberal and even more conservative aversion to ancient democracy continues to this day, in a certain distance, certainly here in Germany, to the mainstream. For the mainstream, ancient democracy is an alien as compared to our modern age. A more clearly committed relationship we would find in the British classical studies, already very clearly expressed in the title of R.W. Livingston's anthology, The Legacy of Greece, a clear commitment to antiquity as a model and at least a thought-provoking value. And Moses Finlay then found it important to update that consideration in his anthology, The Legacy of Greece, A New Appraisal. In Cambridge, the relay has now been taken over by Paul Cartledge, this time with a special focus on ancient democracy. This is precisely the step now which I want to take today, namely to look at, in a step, to not the ancient experience, but rather at our current democratic issues, to then see in a second step to what extent we can identify similar problems in ancient Greece and how the ancient Athenians dealt with them. To this end, I will propose you 10, that is given to me, 10 very brief theses and for this discussion. The first one is on freedom and equality. In our modern constitutions, and now also in the priorities, for example, of the European Union, guarantees of freedom have been given a far greater weight than the principles of equality and equal participation. Many see the gap between the rich and the poor as a threat to our democracies. In archaic times, now if you look at Greece, among other things, the topography of the country may have given people a high degree of freedom indeed. The mountains, the islands. However, historically speaking, with Solon, Cleisthenes, Ephialtes, it was the equal rights that gradually led to the classical democracy. Historically speaking, freedom was the result of equality. The second point would be elites in democracy. And here we have an enormous problem with revolts against the political elites all over. In the US, of course, in Brexit Britain, in Germany, in the emergence of the right-wing nationalist D. What was it like in antiquity? Democracy was largely a construct of the elites, namely the result of aristocratic concessions to the participatory demand of the revolting masses. Similarly today, if we want to regain people's trust in democracy, we will require new and convincing answers for equal participation, not only in rare elections, but in a democratic way of life. At the same time, we have to think again about the need for elites, and if so, which elites we might need. My third point is democracy and oligarchy. I think Aristotle was probably right in saying that every democracy has oligarchic features. At the other end of the scale, as we can see in some countries of the European Union, we can find sham democracies ruled, in fact, by oligarchs, autocrats. Representative democracy harbors particular dangers of bringing forth oligarchic formations, a political class. Classical Athenian democracy was almost perpetually threatened by oligarchic coups d'etats. Apart from a few exceptional situations, democracy was able to hold its own against this for 2.5 centuries. In modern democracies, we recognize oligarchy by arrogance, the arrogance of the political class, and in particular in dealing with and responding or not responding to the citizen. Civic competence and cultural democracy would be my fourth point. The requirement of sufficient civic competence for political participation has not been solved by modern democracy. The discrepancy between participatory rights and political competence of the individual is only exacerbated by the social media developments of our time. Now, in ancient Athens, political education meant the inclusion of all citizens in a culture of highest order. More political education in schools nowadays is certainly necessary, but it is not sufficient. It is not, if it is not possible to involve more people in cultural life in a democracy of culture. Popular will and populism. What's the difference? Populism does not mean listening to the will of the people, but it is rather the political strategy of demagogues to appeal to the lower dispositions of the people, to stir up obsessions of being disadvantaged, and to direct thus cited against all others, against minorities, against all, how our opinions into the nation and thus into their habits. Sometimes in our time, politics that emulate lead after evil can only be effectively countered with convincing policy of the good and the reasonable. My sixth point is defensive debate. I'll make it short. Athens was certainly a democracy that took precautions against being overthrown. All democracies, we're taking risks. We're taking risks. It's a very flatter democracy, and I think we should be much more in putting in more burdens on it. I'd rather see a prophylactic defense of our democratic principles. Point already is democracy in the digital age. Two participatory opportunities, the of life, are predominantly seen as support for democracy. What many people perceive as being an and turning a blind eye to the powers behind are instruments of digito monopolistic capitalism. They can no longer be counted, these forms of capitalism, the old form of reinstalling societal equilibrium and democratic control. Political participation was associated with transparent decision, direct confrontation of opinions in a face-to-face process. Finding democratic answers to the digital threats of the challenge, something which we certainly have to give much more attention to. It deserves time and effort of younger generation fighting and limiting climate change. Versus a democracy of interest. Our democracies are often seen as interplay, a framework for solving interests. Now, today's democracy will be a short-term decision-making. And that is why our democracy sees a serious challenge as opposed to more long-term oriented forms of government. In ancient Athens, particularly with the Cleistinian reforms, it had been possible to rein in particular interests and give the highest priority to the common good of the polis. Our democracies will only be able to assert themselves as molds for the future. They prove those too to be capable of long-term planning for the chances of future generations, and by no means in ethical democracy. Point number 9. And the containment of the coronavirus, however, ethically, I'm not put at the same level, are currently major challenges. In both cases, action has been left with very thin authorizations in decade-old law. Mass demonstrations all over Europe show in one case as in the other how many people feel that purely executive action is not sufficient to legitimize. Such a far-reaching abdication of the People's Assembly in favor of the executive would have been unthinkable. All in questions of the community, our parliaments must again for the legitimity of political action. The 10th point, philosophy. Alien of parts of the population from democracy, in part explained by a lack of debate and communication. This applies above all to questions of fundamental importance, and the way classical Athens, democracy flourished and dialectic with the liberal sciences and arts, but above all through the philosophical schools of thought. For our modern democracy, we need a basement to scientific knowledge and more. The call for more philosophy cannot mean philosophy. I'm not a philosopher, by the way. It should mean an obligation of democratic representatives to basic values and rationalist audit. In my conclusion, these are my 10 minutes. I had to leave many things aside. For example, law, ancient and modern times, that would be another issue. And I think Professor Forsyth has already said and explained that needed the real essential democratic development, archaic and classical Athens. Another would, of course, how to address the weaknesses of ancient Greek democracy, the leaving out of the slaves or complete isolation, and who played no part in public life and politics. Can we still look at the ancient Athenian something inspiring? That's another big debate. Now, 2,400 years after Aristotle, for us a great undertaking to emulate him with the new Athenian constitution and a comparison of the measure their success. So far, we know the constitution of the Athenians only from episodic material of historiography. For a normative study of antiquity aiming at utility for our democratic present and future, it would be worth to cite the experiences and principles of classical democracy. A second work with the title, The Constitution. Thank you for listening and looking forward to meet you all in person when the anniversary is due.
Thank you, Professor Delacroix, for this
Don't promote me only.
remarkable presentation. I have 3 points, and let me say that Professor Delacroix pointed out that in today's democratic governance, what is needed is the rebuilding of trust between the elites and the people, in order for the people to be convinced for the benefits of democratic ruling for all, which is very important. I noted also with interest his reference to ostracism as a means of democracy to defend itself. And finally, I also found stimulating his reference to the role of information technology threats and the need of dealing with this issue in a more transparent way. Thank you for all these fascinating presentations. I don't. Do we have questions in the chat? Maybe not. The system didn't help us today. I have to say that in our session we have followed highly scholarly presentations. As an expert in international relations, I admit that I have to digest all these arguments and conclusions of the presenters. I truly hope that we will soon have written versions of these presentations, and we could also proceed to a publication of a book. I'm very sorry that we couldn't hear Professor Edith Hall, and I hope that we will have the opportunity to include her insights in a future publication. Professor Delacroix, I hope that we can meet in person as you are in Thessalia, the University of Thessalia, and let's cross our fingers for that.
Question.
Thank you all.
Question.
Thank you.
Question?
Yes, please.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Now I do a question to Professor Forsythe in Michigan. And by the way, I'm speaking to you from Volos. I'm speaking to you from Berlin. Yes, okay. And well, do we then agree that I think the rule of law and including the people into the system has preceded their rights and an Egelin movement towards their political rights? That seems to be understood from your excellent presentation, that the rule of law preceded development as we know it in terms of political participation.
I am sorry, but I cannot make out your question. The connection, I keep losing half the words.
I'm sorry, I cannot hear the question.
I couldn't hear it.
And can I try again? Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Right. Are we then in agreement for that the first steps towards greater participation of the people were in the direction of including the judiciary process, that this happened even before the people, the masses of the people, were included into the parliamentary and into the decision-making of policy. That I understood from your presentation included inclusion and participation in the courts first as a side ground for participation in the People's Assembly as we see it in the classical time.
I think I understood the question now. Well, so it's a gradual development, and in the sense that Solon already created a court of appeal before the democracy was founded, in that sense, the people played a role in the judicial process in the early 6th century BC, before the democracy was founded. But one of the key arguments that I was making is that it really doesn't reach full realization, this role of the popular assembly in the judicial process, until the democracy. We don't really know, what sort of cases got referred to the popular assembly, how regular the process was. It's really under Cleisthenes, who founds the democracy in 508, 507 BCE, who really seems to create the dicasteria, the sort of formal systems, a set of courts that adjudicated cases. And it's only with Ephialtes and his removal of power from the Areopagus that the courts seem to become the primary locus for the adjudication of disputes. So it's a gradual process, but in some sense you're right that it does precede the democracy, although there's already assembly, right, in Solon's time. And the 4th century Athenians thought that Solon had invented democracy. So there's already elements of a role for the popular assembly in Solonian Athens. I'm not sure if that was the question you were asking, but that's what I gathered.
Well, I think, thank you very much for differentiating but I think the case be even pushed further back to the draconian reforms, where we do not really find any participatorians. To my knowledge, certainly the idea that people can only be punished only on of written law goes to Dracon, and here we have some first step into the direction of legality. And I think this idea of legality and equality for the law clearly first step on the way to judicial process, and then finally into the truly democratic process. So I think we are in agreement, and therefore I welcome what you had to say about this strengthening people in the judiciary and in the jury system.
Thank you. Yes, you're right that written law comes in the 7th century already, so that's an earlier step. I didn't have time to really talk about that, and I was really focusing more on the role of the people in adjudicating disputes rather than in the 7th century, when probably there were some elite magistrates who wrote down the laws and administered them.
If I may add something.
Yes, please.
Well, I think I'd like to highlight one point in what I was trying to get across to all of you, and that is in the way we look at the classical democracy. It tells certainly something about democracy, but it tells something about ourselves too. You see, if people are reticent to accept that democracy of Athens in the classical age as something which is relevant to them, then very often, as I've been trying to show, there are ideological reasons for this, because it's a model which is not comfortable to all, and it tells a lot about us, the way we look at the ancient model. And this is something which is fascinating also to compare. I can speak especially for my own country, but I would like one day to really hear more about other people's and cultures' relationship to that ancient experience.
Any other question or intervention? Yes, please. Yes, please.
Perhaps you hear me. I want to ask questions with respect to the relationship of people and the elite and democracy and the elite. Now, because the hypothesis is, that democracy is accompanied or there's an effect about the elite, and the elite is necessary and important for democracy. But when you look around in Europe and let's say America, then I would say half of the political leadership is, and the other half is not at all what we call elite. Now the difficulty is to find the elite. Now the problem is once you get, of course, up the scale in the political hierarchy, then you are part of the elite, whether your background is elitarian or whether your education is elitarian. So I doubt, that there's a strong relationship between elite and political leadership in a democracy today. In Athens it was clear, I think, but today I have some doubts. And so the problem is, what kind of democracy we can have, I mean, of course, if you have a lead with high values or not high values, but they know a lot, and so you can have a different democracy than a democracy which is basically only on majorities. So the question is it necessary to have these elites? That was my question. Thank you.
Well, I think maybe if we do notice and look at the revolts which are taking place against the elites, the establishment is the other word, then we may in fact ask ourselves, is this not a misnomer? Should we talk about a revolt against oligarchy? And an elite is something which can still, have a positive connotation to it. An elite is a people. There is possibly an intellectual elite, a cultural elite, and there may be also a virtuous elite, an elite by their virtues and their convictions. But I think so. If we do see a revolt in societal terms, it's not against the elite, because the question is very much if the oligarchies, which we see in places, regretfully also in our democracies, if they are elites. Maybe the problem is that our oligarchies are not really elites. But of course, the question is a very serious one. Do we need elites? And if so, if we do need elites, what kind of elites do we need? I would think rather of the kind and of the rather than of the oligarchic kind. Certainly, if you do look at ancient Athens, you have that mix. Right at the beginning of the history of democracy, you have that rather fruitful mix of what we much as being an elite. Elite was remarkably willing not only to share its powers with the people, because otherwise they would have seen another Pisistratos, but they were willing to share their culture. Yes, and that is fascinating, how the inclusion of the people in the decision-making process of the democracy went alongside and hand in hand with their inclusion in the highest forms of culture. You were speaking of Antigone, of course, and these were the schools for making people, civilized people, understanding conflict and how to address conflict. And that was so important. That was as important as learning how to fight in the gymnasia. Yes, I think I hope we are in agreement that, and how can we, it's thought provoking, and how can we, but I entirely agree with you. I'm not naive about the elites, but I think it's a vast subject. I do not ignore the damage which elitarian ideologies have done in the 20th century. I mean, all the elitist theoreticians of the early 20th century, they all turned out to be fascists, yes? And that's certainly not a reintroduction of an elitarian concept which we want to follow, but a vast subject to continue to explore.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other
The floor, I have
question
more
or
to
intervention?
say. Yes.
Any other question or intervention? We don't have questions in the chat. So if not, let me thank everyone
Yeah,
again.
he has a question.
And there is a question?
Höller has a question. He has a question.
We go to bed now.
That's an excellent suggestion. You see, but it's even later in Athens. It's even later in Athens. So
yes, in Athens it's 10 o'clock.
And I hope
Thank
to see you all next year in Athens. Yes?
Yes, I hope. Me too. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.